Alright, I've played a fair bit of Throne and Liberty during early access, and I gotta say, I was actually pleasantly surprised. I came in as a totally new player, and before trying out the game, I read quite a few articles that were mostly negative about the pay-to-win aspect and it being a PvP-enabled game. Despite all that, I still decided to check things out for myself. Now, let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. AGS, better known as Amazon Game Studio, who already managed to anger Lost Ark fans, who have also managed to make every single mistake in the book with their own MMORPG, and who have now Lord of the Rings fans trembling. They got entrusted by NCSoft to publish the game globally. And at this point, I feel like we're testing out the definition of insanity by hoping that they will do better. Server stability for the EU servers was deplorable, although I did hear that things were mostly fine in North America. And I know that this is a new MMO launch, but I refuse to make an excuse for a company of their size who is struggling with 50k concurrent players spread over 29 servers. If I were AGS, I also wouldn't worry so much about the fans anymore at this point, but rather about other companies' perceptions of them when it comes to publishing games. But enough roasting Amazon, let's take a look at the actual game. When you start out, the leveling experience is smooth and feels well thought out. You won't have to do too many side activities to hit level cap if you follow the main storyline, and the story itself is okay for an MMORPG. It won't win any Pulitzer Prize, but show me one MMO who would. The side quests themselves are your standard run-of-the-mill MMO, kill X enemies, gather X materials, or go from point A to B. I've got nothing to say about those as they're fairly standard in MMOs, except maybe that it was nice there only being a handful per zone as opposed to getting bombarded with quest markers. Instead, I want to focus on moving from zone to zone. You've got your standard teleports, but when it comes to actually traversing the map, NCSoft managed to hit a home run in my opinion. From the get-go, you can morph into various animals, one for running, one for gliding, and one for swimming. Having access to these so soon makes the whole initial experience way nicer. Collectors will also love the fact that you can acquire quite a few different skins for all of these morphs in-game. You can also of course spend some real-world money on some of the cash shop ones, but that doesn't take away the fact that there are some that you can chase by just playing the game. Titles and shapeshifting forms aren't the only things you'll be collecting though. The gearing system itself will have you chase down various enemies or doing dungeons and raids. The game comes with a so-called lithograph book where you can register some of your loot for other, often better rewards. I've been using this to chase some gear that I've been neglecting during the leveling process, and it makes me feel like even chasing some of the most inconsequential enemies is still contributing to my overall account progression. Gearing and building your character gets fairly complex though. You not only have your standard rarities of gear, but you'll also want to upgrade them. Both in level using growth stones, which are different for weapons, armor and trinkets, as well as imbuing them with specific traits. Then we add the skills to that, which are all tied to the weapons that you have equipped. You can equip 2 at the same time, which will grant you access to 12 active and 7 passive skills. And of those 24 active, you can only bring 12 at any given time, as well as 8 of the passive ones. Like gear, you can also upgrade the skill level of your active skills, and throughout your leveling process, you will acquire skill points that you can then spend on them to further increase some of their effects, or even completely change them into a different skill. You might have already guessed it, but a character can equip any weapon they want, so technically there is no need for alts. I say technically, because in the initial stages of the game, the amount of upgrading you can do will be relatively limited. Getting 2 weapons to a decent spot is relatively easy, and I heard a third one isn't all that bad either. So there is something to be said for making a second character if you want to try out some of the other combinations. This somewhat convoluted system comes with a downside, and one that will be apparent throughout the whole game. Time gating. See, you can only get so many skill books, growth stones, and even gear throughout a single session. From the developer's perspective, that's a good thing, because it'll hopefully increase the longevity of the game, which also means that people will probably spend more over time. Content like the open world and regular dungeons are sadly also time-gated. You can complete resistance contracts for a currency called Abyssal Contract Tokens, which are automatically spent by killing enemies in an open world dungeon, which is basically an elite zone where the only goal is to kill enemies for loot. Once you run out of tokens, the fun's over, as the loot won't nearly be worth the time investment. Then you'll also want dimensional contract tokens for regular dungeons, as you need those to open the final chest. The only way that I know of to get these is by just waiting. Every 24 hours you get a set amount, which at level 50 would be just enough for 3 dungeons. Doing dungeons without the possibility of looting that final chest is once again not worth it. A redeeming factor to this system is that you don't need to do the content daily. You can just accumulate the tokens until you hit maximum capacity and then grind it out over a prolonged gaming session. Except a fair few hardcore players, I would actually assume that the caps are high enough that if you have a job and have to take care of a family, you won't actually run out of content. The dungeon encounters themselves are really great in my opinion and have given me back that old school MMORPG feel for the first time in about a decade. Every single dungeon follows the same formula that has you kill enemies on your way to a mini-boss and then ending with a final boss encounter. It's those final bosses that have made me enjoy them so much. Each one of them comes with your standard tank buster and healer check, but thanks to Throne's combat system, every single player is also responsible for blocking or avoiding certain group-wide attacks themselves. And on top of that, all bosses also feature a mechanic that will instantly kill the players failing it, which then often can snowball into a full team wipe, especially for those mechanics where you will need multiple people. I assume that as time goes on, these will be figured out and optimized by the community, as well as be made easier with proper gear and builds. I have heard NCSoft is planning to add a Mythic Plus style of dungeon progression in a later update, and while I do hope that they don't timegate those, I wouldn't be surprised if they do, and I'll touch on why exactly later in the video. Apart from those, there's also a solo dungeon, one that has you scale up 20 floors, but is only worth doing a single time for the rewards, and then one that boasts 2 bosses which rotate weekly. They're nice extras, but they won't keep you occupied for hours on end. The open world activities themselves are interesting, and are the first time I came into contact with PvP enabled zones. If you're wary of the prospect of other players randomly ganking you, there will be peaceful and contested zones that rotate, so you can choose to avoid PvP entirely. All of the events are on a timer and they rotate every few hours. Some will see you just farming mobs and handing in specific loot, while others are massive world bosses that drop some highly sought after items. Up until I was doing one of those farming events, I completely forgot that this game had PvP enabled. So when I wanted to hand in a good amount of items I just farmed, someone killed me, stole my loot and got the progress for themselves. This adds an extra interesting dimension to the game in my opinion, as now not only do you need to make sure to kill as many enemies as possible to hit the top of the leaderboard, but you also need to be more aware of your surroundings. Apart from those events, I haven't dabbled in PvP just yet. I know there are sieges which are supposed to feature massive zergs going head to head, and an arena, but I want to get my build and gear in order first. The game will also reward you for doing as many of the different activities as you can, by the way. There are weekly missions that you can complete, and they will essentially be another source of epic loot. Now that you know about the gearing and the activities, it's time to tackle the second elephant in the room. The pay-to-win reputation this game has. There are 3 types of currencies. Ornate coins you get from collection codices or when Amazon messes up servers, and they can be spent on new Amitoi, which are basically minis you can send off to an expedition and also help you out to loot monsters you kill, as well as on some items you need to upgrade your skills or gear. Then there's Solent, which is just another name for gold and is needed for crafting and upgrading. And then we have Lucent, the premium currency NCSoft wants you to spend your real world money on. And wouldn't you know it, none of the premium currency packs line up exactly with how much an item or a skin costs. This is predatory practices 101. First, you get players to dissociate the value of $1 by offering them a token instead, because psychologically it's gonna be different spending about $20 on a nice new skin instead of 1,100 Lucent. Casinos figured this out ages ago, and gaming companies have been using the same playbook for the better part of last decade. I mean, look at loot boxes, they're basically in-game slot machines if you think about it. Now, while this is predatory, it isn't pay to win. What you can spend your Lucent on though, definitely is. Not only can you get a battle pass that will reward you with items to help you progress your character much faster, but there's even a leveling pass that awards you more of the same. This is gonna make me sad to say, but these have become so standardized in gaming, it probably won't turn any heads anymore. The auction house, on the other hand, exclusively uses premium currency. That means that you can boot up the game, swipe, and literally become stronger just like that. The flip side of this is that those items are provided by other players and that they can get loosened in return. This opens the door to a couple of things. First of all, I think that people put way too much importance on others becoming stronger or getting certain cosmetics simply because they can spend money. You can do the same in World of Warcraft by selling tokens and using that gold to pay for a carry to gear up your character, or in Guild Wars 2 by converting gems to gold and paying for carries to unlock exclusive titles. People having those things doesn't necessarily negatively impact you in those games. It's a bit of a different story for Throne and Liberty, as you will now risk running into those players during sieges or even during open world events, and they will have a numerical advantage. Now, from what I understand, player levels are still relatively kept in check, and that gear isn't the only deciding factor in who would win a matchup. But this is a slippery slope for the future. This might also be a deterrent to some talented players who might not necessarily be able to put in the time to keep up, or who are able to spend the dollars otherwise. Secondly is that the house always wins. I mentioned that you can list items for Lucent and therefore wouldn't necessarily have to pay for anything in the game. I'm already gonna guess that people who will actually be able to do this will be relatively few. If you take any other game as an indication, then becoming a top player in terms of wealth usually means that you take out a lot of the regular play in favor of optimizing every second to make money. I should know this because my whole channel is based around that idea for Guild Wars 2. The reason I say that the house wins though is that every single of those trades are susceptible to a 20% base tax as well as a relatively minor castle tax. That 20% gets deleted, so this isn't a zero-sum game. People will need to keep buying Lucent to keep funding the auction house, because otherwise items will get stuck and all of that theoretical money is just that, theory. So yeah, long term, I actually think that this game has a lot to offer, but that there are some major pitfalls they need to avoid. First and foremost will be the player population. The auction house example I gave already shows why NCSoft needs people to spend on this game to keep the economy flowing. But a too high player population can become just as much of a headache since AGS is running the show. Because there is no better way to scare people away from an online game than server issues, which we've already had a taste of in early access, and let's be frank, AGS's track record speaks for itself at this point. Then there's the time gating, which I mentioned I would come back to later. While this might look like a hardcore first game, everything in the game is actually catering towards more casual players. Not necessarily in terms of skill, but rather playtime. Once you run out of dungeon-specific currency, there is no point in running those for the day, and you won't be farming events all day either, because those are on a timer. Now, what do people who have a job and limited gaming time in common? More often than not, it's disposable income, which NCSoft will ideally want you to spend on Lucent so that you can buy that item that has been holding you back. Lastly, and this one is one for the future, is player power level. Right now everything feels more or less balanced. There's not too many systems to be able to deck out a proper character and keep up with the masses. But if player level becomes too disheveled in the future, then the game might struggle to keep attracting new players when they see that they will need to climb literal mountains to enjoy some of the aspects the game has to offer. But it's gonna be a while before it gets to that. In the meantime, I'm gonna keep enjoying the game as I've had a literal blast during my 5 days of early access.